This is the third in a series of videos about creating the illusion of three-dimensional form in Adobe Illustrator. This video is going to focus primarily on the gradient mesh tool, which is probably going to be the most important tool for you in creating your animal illustration. Before I get into gradient mesh though, I want to show you a new tool that was just introduced with the most recent version of Illustrator 2020. This is the freeform gradient tool. I don't have any professional work to show you with this tool since it's so brand new, and honestly I don't even know the tool that well because I've only had a chance to play with it a couple times, but I just thought I'd make you aware of it. So in the gradient palette we have our standard linear gradient, radial gradient, and now there's this new thing called the freeform gradient. I've got this purple shape selected. I'm going to click freeform gradient. And when I do that, you can see that it has added three little circular objects to the center of this shape. If I hover over each one, you can see that it gets highlighted with a little dashed line. These little things are called stops, and these are the objects that allow you to control the colors of the gradient as well as their position. If I select this one over here in the purple area, you can see the purple color that shows up. It's kind of interesting that it's altered the original color I had in there. I had a color of 20 cyan and 40 magenta, so it's not clear to me exactly why it altered the color that I put in there, but I can easily change it back. I can select this black object, and that also surprisingly is giving me some kind of weird numbers. Let me put something different in there. And then I can click this last one over in the white area. That one really is white. Let me put a different color in there. And you can see that when I change the color of any of these stops, that the colors automatically blend seamlessly from one to another. I can pick them up and just simply move them around, and the gradient reflows automatically. I can add additional stops very easily just by hovering over the object and clicking to add a new one. It picks up the color of whatever the previous one was that I had selected. So I had just selected the purple one, so the new one that I created has that purple color as well. Let me just try something a little different here. If I want to delete one of these little stops, one of these little circular areas, as long as it's selected, I can look over here in the gradient palette, and it's showing that stop, and it's showing the little green color that's inside of it, and there's a trash can icon next to it. That deletes the stop, and then the color of this orange one then kind of reflows to fill the rest of the object. Now right now I'm just creating something that's very brightly colored, but I'm assuming that we could use this to also just create something with a sense of three-dimensional form, to add highlights or shadows to an existing object. So I'm going to take a similar object that from what I started with originally, click the freeform gradient. I kind of wish by default that it would just keep the color that I started with, and I don't know why it keeps changing my colors. I'm going to recolor all of these stops the same. And there should have been a third one down here, but I don't happen to see a third one there. I'm going to move this stop over close to the edge, and I'm going to add a bunch of others right along the edge, as well as some more here in the middle. And then I'm going to add some new stops, kind of intermediate in position between those others. And I'm going to give this a different color. I'm going to go just a little bit darker with the cyan and magenta and add a little black. And I'm imagining that this might be my core shadow color. And then I'm just going to pull these others down a little closer to the edge, imagining that maybe that's my reflected light. So this darker colored stop is going to be the shadow. And if I click a whole bunch more of those, I'm getting some shadows, although it's really got kind of a mottled appearance. I'm not too happy about that appearance. I think there may be another way to do this. If you notice here under the gradient tool, when I have the freeform gradient selected, I have the choice of adding points or adding what are called lines. Let's try this again, only this time using the lines feature. So once again, I'm going to select the object, make it a freeform gradient, and be kind of surprised to see what we get this time. Okay, that's different. I don't know where that orange came from. Once again, let's set this back to the color I had to begin with. Set all of them back to that light purple. And I'm going to move these down towards the edge again. And I think I'll click a couple more in here. Now I'm going to choose lines. And what I found is that I can click on one of these points and then click on another point, and it connects it with a line. And it puts a little bit of a curve in the line. I can move these around. I can add more points. And it's almost like creating a regular path in Illustrator, a regular Bezier curve. And now let's see what happens if I change these colors. Let me just do it real simple and just add, a little black to that. Yeah, I'm going to actually undo that. And before I move on, I'm going to create a new line. Oops. I was hoping that would stay that purple color. I don't know why my color palette shows that it's purple, but it's not. Well, let's try it this way. I'm going to create a new line. All right, let's make it the right color. I have this one run more or less parallel to the original one. I think what that new line is going to do is it's going to prevent any color change that I make in this bottom line from extending much farther into the rest of the purple shape. So now if I select one of these lines, and now I'm going to, let me just add a little bit more cyan and magenta and a little bit of black. Yeah, see, now it's limiting that core shadow more towards the edge of the object and preventing the shadow color from extending farther into the object. Doing this with lines like this is actually very similar to working with gradient mesh, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. So that allowed me to put something that looks like a core shadow along the edge of this object. And I've still got another one of these little stops up here at the top, which I could edit to add more of a highlight to the object. So I think with a little bit of control, and did that actually? It didn't put the colors in that I thought it would. There we go. Maybe let's go even a little lighter. So try playing around with this and see if you can make sense of it, and if you can learn how to control it and end up with the result that you want. Okay, now I'd like to show you the gradient mesh tool. And I'm going to draw another little blob very similar to the one I was just working with. And I'm going to fill it with, let's try a different color this time. Try this light green. So the gradient mesh uses this tool over on the tool menu called the mesh tool. You can just click the letter U on the keyboard to bring that up. And I'm going to click on the object, and it's going to add a series of what are called mesh lines and mesh points. And everywhere there's a mesh point, you can change the color of that point, and that color will then blend seamlessly into the colors of neighboring points. Very similar to the freeform gradient that we just saw. Now, right now, if I position the mesh tool, if I position my cursor in the middle of this object, I'm getting that little slash symbol below the arrow, telling me that I can't add anything here to the middle of this shape. I keep clicking, but it's not doing anything. However, if I hover the cursor right over the edge of the object, right over the edge of the path, then I get this little grid symbol that shows up and a plus sign. And when I click there, notice a couple things. First of all, the stroke disappeared. You cannot put a stroke on an object that contains a gradient mesh. As soon as you click on the object with the mesh tool, the object becomes a gradient mesh object and the stroke disappears. So if you wanted a stroke around this object, you'd actually have to draw it as a completely separate shape. The other thing to notice is that it's drawn this vertical line. There's a mesh point up here at the top where the vertical line intersects the edge of the object, and another mesh point down here where it intersects the other edge of the object. I could do this numerous times throughout the image, adding an additional mesh line and then another one over here. All right, let's actually try that a little differently. There we go. So I've got 3 vertical mesh lines and a total of 6 mesh points where those lines intersect the edge of the object. Now I can add another one. Let's put one down here along the edge. I'm going to actually click on one of the mesh lines that I created, and that adds a new mesh line, this time running horizontally across the object. It's created a mesh point out here where that horizontal line intersects the edge of the object, and it's created a whole series of additional mesh points everywhere where that horizontal line intersects one of the vertical lines. And if I continue to add additional mesh lines, every time I add a new one, it's creating a whole bunch of additional points. Now, currently, I can only add additional mesh lines or mesh points by clicking right on the edge of the object or right on one of these existing mesh lines. The reason for that is because of the way that I tend to work in Illustrator, because of one of the preferences that I always change. You may recall that I always go into the preferences under Selection and Anchor Display, and there are 2 preferences that I always change. By default, when you first start Illustrator, this is not checked, Object Selection by Path Only. I always like to have that turned on because I always like to be able to drag my selection arrow across a whole bunch of anchor points, or drag my selection arrow across a whole bunch of small objects to pick them up. But if there's an object in the background behind the things that I'm trying to select, if I can select by the fill color, I can inadvertently pick up the objects in the background. That's why I prefer to work with selection by path only. However, when I have that turned on, it means that I can only create new mesh points by clicking on an existing path. So it changes the behavior of the gradient mesh tool as well. If I turn this selection off, close the preferences, now you'll notice that if I hover the cursor over any part of the object, it still has that little grid symbol and the little plus sign, meaning that I can add a new mesh line and a new mesh point at any point within the fill of this object. But before I forget, I'm going to go back to my preferences. I still prefer to work with this preference turned on so that I can only select an object by its edge, by its path, and I don't worry so much about how it affects the behavior of the gradient mesh tool. I just have to remember that I can only create new points and new lines by clicking either on the edge of the object or clicking on one of these existing mesh lines. It's really not that big a deal. Once I've created a bunch of mesh points and mesh lines, I can also delete existing mesh points and mesh lines. If I hover over that point and if I hold down the Option key, holding the Option key, if you can see how the cursor changes, I get a little minus sign. And so I can delete that mesh point. But pay attention to what happens when I delete that one point. Deleting a single mesh point down here in the lower left also deletes the entire vertical line that that mesh point was part of, and also deletes the entire horizontal line that that mesh point was part of. So I'm going to go ahead and add back one of these vertical lines. So that's how you delete mesh points, but just be aware you delete a point and you're deleting not only the point itself, but also the vertical and horizontal mesh lines associated with it. So I'm going to Command Z and undo that. If I select one of these points with the white selection arrow, you'll notice that it has little handlebars associated with it. Those handlebars do a couple of different things. They change the orientation of the mesh lines, but they're also going to affect the way colors interact with one another. So before I actually demonstrate that, it's probably a good idea if I start adding a little color or some different colors to this object. I'm going to select the mesh points that run along the bottom, or almost run along the bottom edge of this object, not quite on the bottom edge, but adjacent to it. And I'm going to assume that this is going to be my core shadow. And I held down the Shift key while I was selecting these points so I could select multiple points at the same time. And I'm going to add a little bit more cyan, and I'm going to add a little bit of black. And you can see how that easily puts a shadow running along the bottom of the object. I could also click one of these points, like this one up here, and give that a highlight color. A much lighter version of that same greenish color. So now you can see I've got some different colors in my object, and you can see how they blend seamlessly from one to another. So now if I were to select, say, this highlight color, now you can see what happens when I play around with these handlebars. If I elongate the handlebar, it actually stretches that color farther over. And let me just make that a brighter color so you can see it a little bit better. Let's just make it something really radically different here so it shows up really well. So when I grab the handlebar and drag it, it pushes that color farther over towards the right. If I make this other handlebar shorter, it's going to have the same effect. It's going to pull that orange color closer towards this point. And when I rotate the handlebars, it's also going to change how that color blends in with its neighboring points. pull this longer and pull that orange color down more. I can also move points around. I can simply select a point with the white arrow and move it, and that not only moves the point but also moves the colors around a little bit. There's also another way of moving points. If I go back to my mesh tool, if I hold down the shift key with the mesh tool selected, it lets me move the point, but the point is sliding along the existing mesh line. It's maintaining the curvature of that existing mesh line and letting me simply slide these anchor points or mesh points along the line. And I can do this along the edge of the object as well. This is particularly helpful if you want to change where one of these mesh lines intersects with the edge of your object, but you don't want to run the risk of actually changing the shape of the object. See, if I just use a regular white arrow and I try to move this point up or down, it's moving, not only the point, but it's moving the whole edge of the object. Whereas if I hold down the shift key and I use my mesh tool, I can slide that point along the edge of the object without actually altering the shape of the object. So if I wanted to pull this core shadow down closer to the edge of the object, I can just slide all of these anchor points down, or all of these mesh points down. But then if I wanted the shadow to extend up a little higher, I could move these points up and then move this point up. Again, I'm holding the shift key down with the gradient mesh tool, and that allows me to slide a point along the existing path. So let me go back, let me just check what color that 30 and 30. So there's my highlight. I could also add just a hint of a shadow all the way around the edge of the object. I could select all of these points around the edge. A little hint of a shadow here would suggest that the object was receding back into space. Let me once again boost the cyan a little bit, add just a little bit of black, and I'm able to create a little bit more sense of three-dimensional form. So let me show you a few examples of this gradient mesh at work. I really haven't used it a whole lot in my own professional work. Here's a really simple schematic illustration of some receptors on the surface of a cell. And there was no attempt whatsoever to try to make these look like the real objects. But I didn't want to use just a simple square or a triangle or something either. So I used gradient mesh to give these geometric shapes a little bit more, just a little bit more form to them. So you can see that object there and this one. And these actually have multiple objects, multiple mesh objects. There we go, if I can get hold of it. Here was another one. This shows DNA replication. And I wanted to create some relatively simple shapes for some of the proteins that are involved in the process of DNA replication. In this case, topoisomerase, which is one of the things that helps unwind the double helix. And you can see that it's a simple, relatively simple gradient mesh shape. My students use this a lot for this particular project, for the animal plate project. Here's a shark that a student did, and then here's this this isopod. This is like a pill bug, but this is a giant one that lives at the bottom of the ocean. This thing's like 18 inches long. And you'll see that the top of the shell is made up of a whole series of gradient mesh shapes. all of that blotchiness that you see, all that blue and green blotchiness is all created just with gradient mesh. So if you were to zoom in on this closely, you could see how there are some dark green objects and then some lighter green and then some sort of turquoise blue shapes. Even the limbs have gradient meshes in them. All of these different segments of the segmented limbs all have little gradient mesh objects in them. And one thing that's nice about illustrating an arthropod, either an insect or a crustacean or whatever group these pill bugs fall into. One thing that's nice about them is that the word arthropod means jointed legs. They have these jointed appendages, meaning it's very easy to divide the animal up into small pieces because you've just got all of these separate hinged segments in the limbs. And even, on the body, there's a whole series of separate sort of segmented plates running along the body of the animal. If you choose an animal that doesn't have these kind of jointed appendages, then there's one other consideration that you have to keep in mind. Let's go back to this shark illustration that I demonstrated to you before. And you may remember I said that when you're drawing your animal, one of the things you have to do is divide it up into component shapes. So in this case, the top of the shark and the sides all the way back to the tail is one shape, but this snout area I ended up doing as a separate shape, and the lower jaw and bottom part of the mouth is a separate shape, and something like the pectoral fin and the dorsal fin are also separate shapes. Something like a shark obviously doesn't have those jointed hinged appendages, like an insect. So where the pectoral fin meets the body, it's really important to make sure that you match up the colors on the different gradient mesh shapes. So there's a gradient mesh point right here on part of the shark, and you look at the color and you'll see it's nice round numbers, 12, 5, and 5 for cyan, magenta, and yellow. And then if I look at the mesh object for the pectoral fin, this one point right here has exactly the same color numbers in it. And that helps this fin look like it's just sort of emerging out of the side of the shark. It's not perfect. There's a little bit of an edge visible here, but it's not too bad, especially when you're zoomed out. Similar thing up here. There's a blue anchor point or a blue mesh point right there, 53, 20, and 15. And if I can get hold of the mesh point on the body of the shark, you see it's got exactly the same numbers. And again, that really helps to make this fin look like it's blending seamlessly into the body of the shark. Same thing with the dorsal fin up here. The mesh points down here are exactly the same color as the corresponding or the nearby mesh points on the back of the shark. So that's going to be another little trick to creating a convincing animal, depending on what kind of animal you illustrate, and depending on exactly how you divide it up into these component shapes. You may find yourself doing a lot of that where you're having to make sure that the color on one side of one object matches the color of a different gradient mesh object right next to it. So that does it for gradient mesh. Hopefully you'll be able to start using this tool right away, and it's a bit of a learning curve, but I think this project will really help you master it.